Yeah, definitely. Thank you all so much for being here, first and foremost. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing. And as we get into this, I think this was just a really fun topic in general that Danica brought up of let's talk about things that we can agree on within this time. And I think just even noting too is first and foremost, nutrition is a very young science. It really started evolving um, especially within like the global stage in a sense about the 1920s to 1950s. So it is really a young science. And I think that that's why so many things can be very controversial or they feel really convoluted, or why it seems like one day like eggs are great for you and not the other day, and or coffee. And so those are some things that I hope to answer today, and then also really talk about the things that we all can agree on. So again, if you do have questions, feel free to unmute yourself, feel free to pop on and ask. You can also pop in the chat box, and then again there will be a time at the end for questions as well. So if you don't know me, I am your registered dietitian. I am the co-owner of Evolve Flagstaff here in Flagstaff, Arizona. And what I specialize in is I specialize on working with people on their relationship to food. I work also with a lot of athletes, eating disorders, and then also general wellness. So in the sense of gastrointestinal disorders, even if you're just confused because we really don't have enough nutrition education in most of our education establishments in general. So I think that a lot of times we just get really confused in general. So that's really my specialty, is really trying to clear up a lot of the nutrition information and really understand how this can work for you. Also knowing that today is not based for specific medical one-on-one individual attention. So if you have questions during this time, feel free to again ask them, but know too that if you have questions about this, you can also see me one-on-one, and it's totally free. It's included in your name. So that's an option for you as well, if you have something that's a little bit more specific to just you. So I'm going to answer this off the bat of why is there so much conflicting information. And so like I mentioned before, is that nutrition is a very young science. There is new research emerging all the time. There is fascinating research kind of that we'll talk about a little bit today of new metabolism research that was just released in August of 2021 that really clears up a lot of questions about other of like sorry, that question just distracted me a little bit. That clears up a lot of things that we had thought for a long time. All right, so we're going to talk about what we can all agree on, and then also I'm going to provide you with actionable steps you can take to start off a healthier year. So one thing I want to clear up as well is dietitians and nutritionists are not inherently the same. So I think that where you get your information from is really, really important and should be noted. So dietitians at least go through an undergraduate degree. It's now required to have a master's. I have my master's. We also have 1,200 hours underneath dietitians during as like a bonus fifth year. So we have a lot of education in nutrition. We have a lot of education in the psychology around food and how food really works for us. And a lot of times there's a lot of nutritionists in the world who may go through some really quality training, but they are not inherently the same. Technically, any of you, if you wanted to go and promote services as a nutritionist, you technically could. So it's not a protected term. So just know that if you are online or out in the world and looking for information, really look for that RD or RDN credential behind someone's name. All right. Dietitians too, this is one thing that comes up a lot in my office, is a lot of times people think that I'm going to take away food from them or take the joy out of food or joy out of eating. And really to me, my goal is how can we really promote that joy of eating, and how can we really start to find ways that work best for you? So we are not the food police. We don't generally demonize food or tell you that you can never eat certain things. And really, again, try not to make it that there's a binary of food, of a black and white thinking. And we'll talk a lot about that today as well. All right, so first and foremost, I'm going to go kind of with a bold move here, is that diets don't work. And here's why. So, according to research, 95% of diets fail, and all diets fail, meaning that within 1 to 5 years, people will either regain the weight back that they lost, and then oftentimes, too, they will regain more. And this was really fascinating. This is some of the metabolism research that came out recently, is that basically what happens is when we start to go on a hyper restrictive diet, so even diets that are low as in even like 1,200 calories, or especially even lower than that, what that does from a physiological standpoint is that puts our body in a kind of stress and reserve mode, and that's going to lower how much we're burning at rest. So that's called our basal metabolic rate. So it lowers how much we're burning at rest. And what we found is that technically sometimes that can come back and we can go back to kind of a normal state of where we were before that hyper restriction, but sometimes we actually don't come back from that. And so it's really going to depend. And so that's where, to me, it's really looking at trying to shift away from this very extreme mentality to looking at what's going to work best for you. And I think it's also hard to say in the sense of what works. A lot of times people say, well, I'm just going to say keto worked really well. But then they're looking for something else. And so to me, it's like, well, did that inherently work? Otherwise, it would be something that would be sustainable and you wouldn't have to look for another diet. A really fascinating research study, we all probably have heard of The Biggest Loser before, the big hit TV show that had Jillian Michaels and all these trainers, and they were kind of big major bullies. But what happened was that they measured their BMRs at the beginning of the show, and then they measured them 6 years later, and they found that they burned on average, even though they maintained their diets and general exercise regimens on their maintenance programs, they burned overall 500 calories less than people who did not go on extreme diets. So that's something just to think about. Of like, to me, my kind of key word here is if you can't do it for the rest of your life, what's the point of doing it? So it's really trying to look at how do we find that sustainability overall. Next, we want to look at diets will oftentimes, because they're so prescriptive and very restrictive, they will lack in essential nutrients that we need for our bodies to maintain optimal physiological function. Because diets also create this binary of good food versus bad food, or have a very specific meal plan, they can also increase that anxiety around food. Even something now of where it's not inherently a diet, but a lot of food sensitivity tests will make people really hyper vigilant about it. And when we actually look at the mental aspect behind food, is that we start to see that the more anxiety we have around a food, or even if something that we've maybe reincorporated because we may not be on a diet anymore, but we still have a lot of feelings about that. And what that can do is that can actually impact our gut of how quickly it's going to absorb food, how it's going to process that food, and also how it feels with certain foods. All of these things typically on diets, even if we think about Whole30 or something like that, where it's absolutely, it's restrictive in a lot of different ways, but it's temporary. It's because it's 30 days. It's not meant to be for the rest of your life. And so what happens is people will kind of go into this all or nothing approach, and then they may find quote unquote success during it. But then again, afterwards, they're not really taught what to do afterwards. So to me, it's important to look at how do we actually eat and how do we relate to food? Because again, diets don't teach us what to do when you're not on a certain protocol. They just teach you to be on that protocol for life. But we know that birthdays happen. Then we just ended the holiday season, and holidays happen. And so it's really important to look at and zoom out of not just right now, but how are we going to really navigate the situation as we continue on through the rest of the year and our lives as well. All right. This is one thing that I really like to think about too, is because diets will often disconnect us from our hunger cues and what we need, because we are all technically born intuitive eaters. What happens though is that we either get in the way of that, or maybe caregivers get in the way of that, or even just access to food can oftentimes get in the way of how we relate to hunger. And so I like to think of, there's a lot of different theories about hunger scales, but I like to think about a pendulum, because pendulums have reactionary effects on either end. And so, what diets will technically do, or even if we're just not paying attention to hunger cues, or if we don't understand what our hunger cues are, and if we hang out in this extreme hunger space, what that will technically do, and typically will show up as, for some people, increased anxiety. This will be deprivation, and this can be, again, in the sense of dieting, or even if we're just really busy in life, we can end up hanging out over here on this extreme end of hunger or not meeting our body's needs, which will then, once we do eventually get around to eating, we'll kind of end up in that opposite effect where we end up eating more than we're comfortable with, feeling overfull, which can often also end up in guilt and shame, or even if it's not a clinical binge, something that feels like a binge or very out of control for that individual. And then also what this does is this will decrease our awareness, because typically if we're hanging out over here on the very edge, then we're in this guilt and shame cycle. And then we're like, well, I'm going to do better next time, so I'm going to do better tomorrow. So typically what we'll do is then we'll go back to that extreme sense of hunger and anxiety, and this pendulum just keeps swinging. And so if we can actually get out of those extremes and start to look at,
want to do that Friday.
Okay, what is satisfying to me? How do we start to listen into our own hunger and fullness cues? And those are not just physical fullness cues or physical hunger cues, but those could be mental cues, again, like anxiety, decreased cognition, lack of focus, feeling tired. Lots of different things can tell us when we're hungry that may not be physical, because if you've been through a severe period of restriction in your life, then your body's probably stopped knocking on your hunger door, because it's like, whatever, you don't listen to me anyways. So it's important to look at, how do we listen into that? And then also, how do we know when we're satisfied? Do we pay enough attention to listening into that feeling of, I feel food in my stomach, I feel like I can be done with this food? And I think also diets or restriction will often put us in this scarcity mindset around food, meaning that I may never get this thing again. So I may never, around the holidays, I may never get this cookie again, so I might as well eat them all now. Or if we're eating out, I may never get this food again, where it's like, no, we can easily take that food, maybe if you want to pack it up so that you can have another meal with it and enjoy it again. So it's really, how do we find this balance in between the two so that we can actually optimally function through our days and through our lives. And so this is kind of what that looks like, is it's typically this big kind of swinging of these extremes on either end. And it's, if we can start to look at what works for you, maybe that's eating more frequently, maybe that's staving off that extreme hunger. And it's all going to depend on you as an individual and your physical activity levels, how much you sleep, what else you do in your day, how much brain power you need in your day too. That's going to depend on how you feel hunger. So it's really important to, again, get out of those extremes and really start to connect back in. And that's one of the main things that I really focus on. So if you're someone who's like, I end up in this kind of pendulum all the time and I don't know how I feel, that's something I'd love to work with you on, to figure out how we can do that better for you. Okay, so yes, there is music on, actually, my background. Thanks for bringing that up. There's actually a lunch class happening right outside my door. So hopefully I'm speaking loudly enough and hopefully it's not too distracting. Okay, so as we go on from here, a lot of times people think of, there's good foods and bad foods. So let's talk about this. To me, your relationship to these foods is more important than the nutrient content. And so what that means is that all foods will provide nutrition and sustenance. So in that sense, that even if it's something in the sense of like broccoli is technically a quote unquote good food, which we've been told before. But if we just ate broccoli all day, every day, then we know that we'd be missing out on other nutrients and other vital parts of a healthful diet. If we just ate pizza, then we'd obviously still be missing out on those other vital nutrients. But I think it's important to look at, if pizza is something that brings you, that you have and engage in at certain times, or if it's cookies or whatever it is, if those things either bring back memories of comfort or even nostalgia, or bring us into community, knowing that we can zoom out a little bit, and if we can pay attention to how we feel around those foods, then we can really start to look at recognizing that food is more than just the calories in, calories out, but knowing that our relationship to it's going to be really important. foods don't have morality. So there are no foods that you can eat that will make you a better person or foods that will make you a quote unquote bad person. And labeling them in this way will actually make them more desirable for us. So the more we tell ourselves no and that we can't have these things, then the more we're going to actually want them, because willpower will only last for so long, and we're actually not able to say no eventually. And when we do engage with those foods, once we finally do quote unquote give in, then we normally end up eating more than we're comfortable with, which means that then we end up on the other side of that spectrum. And so really starting to look at how do we normalize these foods? How do we not go into times where we're going to encounter these foods totally starving? How do we not quote unquote save our calories? And how do we also get away from that mentality of this is good and this is bad? Because I think that words really matter around food, and words really matter around what we're saying to ourselves and what we're portraying. Also, if you live in a family and have kids around you, you probably want them to know that it's okay to have birthday cake at times, but birthday cake is probably not going to be something that you eat every single day. And again, there's going to be a reason why we eat a variety of foods, different occasions, different celebrations. And there's going to be times where we also eat maybe some more of those foods that are thought of as good, where it's like those are probably going to be parts of our everyday. And so it's just looking at how do we zoom out and not get so hyper focused on these very specific things. So in each of these, I'm going to have a little habit for you to think about. And so when we start to think about this, I want you to think about refraining from that black and white thinking. And instead of demonizing yourself or punishing yourself or really getting down on yourself for eating certain foods or feeling like you've quote unquote given in, understand why you're eating these things. There's a lot of times too, if we think about emotional eating, that people will get really focused on that. And I'm like, I always emotionally eat. And to me, we can't take the emotion out of food, because if we go all the way back to when we were infants, when we used to cry or when we were upset, we were often fed and also held. So there is that comfort aspect around food that we can't totally weed out, but it's important to look at if that's your only tool in your toolbox now as you're an adult, and you should have a variety of tools in your toolbox. If food is your only tool in your toolbox to get to make you feel better, then we really need to look at how do we broaden that toolbox, and how do we start to zoom out and really understand of how do we get to the root of this feeling. And so that can be something that you can be done either in therapy, so utilizing some of your other resources that you have available to you. Maybe it's even with your health coach. With me, I talk a lot about this too. So it's understanding why we're eating, and understanding too of what is our relationship to these foods. Okay, carbs are an essential part of a healthful diet. So if you've been around for some of you probably longer than me in this world, but we've watched the low fat craze, we've watched the low carb craze, we've watched all of this evolution of diet, and really they're all kind of the same in different clothing. So when we look at diets in general, they're all, when we look at them side by side, whether it be a low calorie diet, a low carb diet, a low fat diet, a Mediterranean diet, all of these things, what they are is generally just a calorie restriction and increasing your overall fruits and vegetable intake, typically. And so especially right now, carbs are pretty demonized in our culture. And this is really, again, if we even think about that pendulum factor, is if we go from one end to where in the 90s, it was like, well, the food pyramid and everything should only be carbs. And so we went from that aspect and everything should be low in fat, and from that aspect, and now we're kind of on the other end to where we've realized that didn't make us feel very good either. And that didn't actually improve our overall health outcomes. So now we're in this low carb craze, and carbs are thought a lot of times that they could increase weight gain, that they're not essential for your body. But I want to kind of dig into that a little bit today. So carbohydrates are your body's preferred source of energy for your brain, cells, and muscles. So every single cell in your body is going to need some sort of glucose. And so we want to look at, obviously, where is that coming from? But knowing that carbs can be part of a healthful diet. If you are an active person, so if you like to move your body a lot of people, obviously within Flagstaff, typically the reason why we live here is because we like to be outside and we like to move. And so carbohydrates are going to be an essential part of fueling that activity, but then also making sure that you can actually recover after that activity as well. And so grains are going to be one thing specifically that have been really demonized because, again, food pyramid, it was mostly grains at the bottom. And so most people just ate those. But they are going to be essential in providing fiber, B vitamins, magnesium, selenium, and iron, which are things that typically, if we cut those out, most people are actually going to become deficient in if they don't have, if they're not making up in other ways. So definitely grains can be a really, really helpful part of a diet. They're also going to make sure that we have adequate hormonal balance. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Cutting out carbohydrates doesn't actually result in long-term weight loss. So if anyone here has ever done a either like keto or low carbohydrate diet, what will often happen typically is because carbohydrates will be stored as this fancy molecule called glycogen in our liver and in our muscles. And so what will happen is if we're not taking carbohydrates in, our body will start to utilize that as fuel for a little bit. And what happens, because glycogen is one molecule of glucose with 2 of water, that's where that initial rapid weight loss will come from. So it could be anywhere from 10 to 15 pounds, but really what that is it's just a lot of water weight. And then we really start to see that weight shift or decrease really normalize over time and sometimes even plateau for some people. And where we can really start to get in the weeds is that low carbohydrate diets, if they're done long term, they can actually disrupt sleep, because serotonin is one thing that is made in our gut when we eat carbohydrates, which is essential for also making tryptophan and melatonin, which is something that helps us get to sleep and have restful sleep. Testosterone is also one thing that can be decreased through low carbohydrate diets. Serotonin is one of the things that does help regulate our mood. So our mood can be kind of a little wonky if we don't have enough carbohydrates. And because our brain relies on so much glucose for it to function, we can see a decrease in cognitive function. Yes, I'm sure you know people, maybe even you yourself have done a keto or low carb diet in the past, and you've realized like, I haven't died and I've been okay. That is true. Our bodies are very smart and we are animals, and the human body has been through thousands and thousands of years of evolution. So it will get it done, but we're really looking at how do we optimize our bodies. All right, so one takeaway or one habit you could take away from this would be looking at incorporating whole grains or high fiber carbohydrates. This could even be things like beans or legumes into your main meals, because one thing that I find too is either if people are not eating enough carbohydrates or eating enough in their day, what happens at the end of their days, they end up feeling ravenous and feeling like they're not done with food, even though they feel like they've eaten dinner and they've eaten enough. That's because our bodies have not gotten their needs met. So eating carbohydrates can actually switch off our hunger cues and make us feel more satiated by that meal. Okay. So with that, cutting out any major food or macronutrient group is unnecessary. Obviously, if you have some sort of major food allergy, if you have celiac disease, if you don't tolerate lactose and you're lactose intolerant, then that's a very different conversation. But cutting out any major food or macronutrient group isn't necessary. And then, so when we start to look, so macronutrients are things that give us energy. So I've already talked a lot about carbs, but they are carbs and protein and fat. And so those are the things I like to think of macronutrients as straight up cash. Like they're the things that we eat them and we can actually go do stuff. Micronutrients are going to be all of our vitamins and minerals, antioxidants, phytonutrients, and those aren't inherently, we need those to function, but those aren't going to give us energy unless we're actually deficient in them. And those are going to be the things that are essential for actually processing and for us to metabolize our carbs and our proteins and our fat and to make our cells function. So I talked a lot about carbs and what they do, so you already should have that. Protein is going to be essential for immune function, tissue repair, brain function as well, and long-term satiation. So as we learned in the 90s, or if you've ever been maybe on a higher carb diet and been like, well, I'm hungry all the time, typically that could be because we may not be getting enough of the other parts of our diet too. So when we start to layer on some protein, that's going to decrease how quickly things are digested, and it's going to keep us fuller longer. So that's going to be an essential aspect as well. Same thing with fats. Fats are essential for keeping our brain healthy, but also for nutrient absorption. If we don't have fats, we're actually not going to be able to absorb our fat-soluble vitamins as well, meaning that we may run into bone issues, we may run into blood clotting issues, skin and eye issues, things like that. So fats are really essential. And they're going to be something too that's going to slow down our digestion and help keep us satisfied in between those meals. So I like to think carbs turn our hunger switch off, proteins, fats, and then fiber is going to help keep that hunger switch off until we can get hungry again and have another meal. Fiber is also essential to improve digestive regularity, so to keep your bowel movements normal, to keep things moving through you, and also to make sure that our microbiome, so all of our bacteria that lives inside of our gut and in our colon, fiber is going to be their main food and make them happy so that they actually have energy to help regulate even our hunger and fullness. Bacteria is in charge of that. It can help with mental health. There's a lot of different things that our microbiome will actually do to impact our bodies. So these little bacteria do a lot of things for us. And so fiber is essential to keep them healthy. And so a takeaway from this is to incorporate all of your macronutrients into each meal and fiber. And so what that means to me is, even if it's a lot of times people get really caught up in like, what's a meal, what's a snack? And to me, snacks, we're eating them generally because we're hungry. And so to me, to get to the bottom of that is looking at a snack is technically just a miniature meal. So instead of just grabbing something quick, like a handful of crackers, it's like, how about we add on to that and really start to look at, can we add in maybe some nuts for some added protein, some added fiber, and some added fat, so that we don't find ourselves 30 minutes later going back to those crackers and feeling like you can just never get ahead of this hunger. All right. You don't need a cleanse or a detox. So this is something else that we all agree on, and I'm going to explain why. So the reason why is because your skin, in the way that you sweat, your liver, your gastrointestinal tract, so your liver, your kidneys, everything in the sense of even how we excrete, all of our waste products, all of these are going to be the most sophisticated ways that our body can detox itself. So green leafy vegetables, typically you'll see things in either detoxes or cleanses that have a lot of like green juices or powders or things like that. And yeah, green leafy vegetables are going to offer a lot of antioxidants that help support our liver function, but they're not inherently going to be the thing that helps our liver cleanse itself. Our liver is going to do that on its own. Our liver is in charge of making sure that any chemicals or toxins that we're taking in are being processed and metabolized out, even if it's prescription medications. Our kidneys are actually the thing that helps filter out all of our blood. So any waste products from our blood, our kidneys are going to process that, and then we get excrete that through urine. Our gastrointestinal tract, obviously, it's going to take out anything that we don't need or any of the byproducts of metabolism, and then we get excrete these through our feces. So drinking enough water is going to be essential for our gastrointestinal tract, because it likes to stay moist and have that regularity. Obviously, if we're not drinking enough water, we can end up to being more constipated or not have those persistent bowel movement. So in that sense, drinking enough water is going to be helpful to rid waste out of our gastrointestinal system. And same thing with our kidneys. If we don't have enough blood volume, then our kidneys aren't going to be able to actually detox our blood as well as they should be able to. All right, so your habit for this one is to increase your water intake. And so everyone, it's going to depend, obviously, if you're living in Flagstaff here, we live at elevation. If you move your body, you're going to sweat a lot. So there's a lot of different ways we can think about this, of how much do I actually need. Sometimes that 8 ounce glasses is enough for some people. But again, if you're moving your body, if you're sweating a lot, then that's probably not enough. So to me, it's looking at, maybe can we start off with just having like baseline of 2 liters of water. You don't actually have to drink a gallon of water a day. For some people, especially if you exist in a much smaller body, that may be too much water for you, and then you may be ridding your body of really important electrolytes. So in that case, we can start off with drinking enough water, and maybe starting off with like at least 2 liters. Again, if you want specific recommendations on this, we can go through sweat rate and talk about all these different things and get really into the nitty gritty. But making sure that you do have enough, because I find that especially now that most of us exist in a masked world, that we don't end up drinking enough water because it's not as easy to. So that can be a really good, simple thing that we can start to do and incorporate into our new year that's going to help our body cleanse itself and detox itself. So you don't need a fancy pill. You don't need anything magical in that sense for your body to detox. All right. Some of y'all are probably taking part in the sugar challenge right now. And so sugar is sugar. So let's talk about what this means. So depending on the type of sugar and depending on the form that it's going to come into, it's going to eventually be broken down into glucose. Same thing, carbohydrates will be broken down into glucose. Just depending on how quickly they will get broken down is going to depend on either what you pair with them. So are you getting a protein and a fat in this? Also, are you getting fiber in this as well? Fiber and proteins and fats are going to decrease how quickly these are digested. And so things like glucose are generally going to get absorbed, and sucrose are going to get absorbed through our digestive tract. The difference is fructose is going to have a delayed reaction on our blood sugar levels. And what will happen, because fructose is a mixture of glucose and fructose, or fruit is a mixture of glucose and fructose. And so fructose will actually have to first get processed in our liver, but then eventually will get turned into glucose. So no matter if it's raw, if it's maple syrup, if it's honey, sugar in itself will be processed eventually and get broken down into glucose. And so when we think about that, it's important again to look at more so how are we engaging in these things and what else are we pairing them with. So obviously a spoonful of sugar is not going to be equal to an apple, because an apple is going to have fiber, it's going to have other nutrients in it that's going to help make sure that we're not going to absorb that all super quickly, but also it's going to give us more benefits. Same thing with honey. There's going to be some antioxidants in honey and other benefits too that you may not find in a white table sugar, but it's looking at what are you putting it in? What's the purpose? What do you prefer? And so making sure that if you are eating sugar, it's like, let's make sure there's some fiber, some micronutrients, as well as that you're eating it along with some other balanced meals. So this is your habit. Most of you are decreasing this probably in general anyways, is being mindful of your sugar intake. And so one thing too is when we talk about decreasing sugar intake, we're really looking at added sugar. So making sure that we're not going over that 20 to 25 grams of added sugar a day. And so through the sugar challenge, you will get a lot of education on how to read labels, how to be aware of the added sugar that we're taking in, and also looking at how do we maybe even just decrease our reliance on sugar. Sugar, again, and carbohydrates are our body's main source of energy. So that's why it's so pleasurable for our brains, and that's why it tastes good, which is also why food manufacturers put it in food. And so in that sense, it's really looking at how do we also wean ourselves somewhat off of this reliance. And for people who come into my office and they're like, I just feel like I always need something sweet after a meal. To me, I like to think about, okay, are you still hungry after that meal? And what would happen if you didn't for a day or 2 days? And then we can start to look at, okay, but then if you did the next day, do you still feel like you have to have it or need it? Or is it just a habit and a habitual cycle that you're in? And so one thing you can do too is you can look at maybe shifting to other forms of sweeteners. My big caveat with these is if you have any sort of gastrointestinal issues, actually artificial sweeteners can sometimes lead to more cramping or bloating or things like that, or actually disrupt our microbiome, depending on what it is. So to me, with artificial sweeteners, they're also multitude and exponentially sweeter than table sugar. So if you get used to having an artificial sweetener all the time, as opposed to sugar, when you do go to eating actual sugar, you may actually feel like you're taking in more because you're trying to get that same impact of that artificial sweetener. So to me, it's looking at how do we decrease our reliance and how do we start to really shift our palates away from always needing sugar and always relying on that. And then how do we start to sometimes, possibly, if you do take in a lot of sugar, maybe it's looking at simply replacing, if it's like sugar sweetened beverages, maybe it is starting to shift to unsweetened beverages. Maybe it's starting to shift to adding some artificial sweeteners in, but again, not just completely swapping and replacing, because we're not then retraining our brains to appreciate other foods as well. I'm sure we could talk about sugar all day, but I'm not going to. All right, so here's another thing we can all agree on. It is that everyone should be eating more fruits and vegetables. So fruits and vegetables are essentially a multivitamin in food form. And so a lot of times, I was actually even at the store the other day, and there was someone who was really excited about getting a multivitamin, which I was like, great, cool, you're making a step. But also it's like we can get all of our nutrients that we need through the food that we eat as long as we're eating a variety of them. And so fruits and vegetables are going to be rich in antioxidants. So antioxidants are things that help our body and are actually, our body is always going through some sort of oxidation process. And so antioxidants, if we have too much oxidation in our body, that's typically what leads to disease or cancer or things like that. And that's going to be in excess. So a lot of these antioxidant rich foods are actually going to be preventative and helpful to our cells to make sure that they're not getting all of these like wild oxidative properties. And it's actually going to rein those in and help neutralize them. So antioxidants are really going to be found in a lot of your brightly colored vegetables. So all of your reds and greens and purples. So looking at, can we start to incorporate those in our day so we're giving our body a chance to actually, again, cleanse itself through food as opposed to adding something else in. They're also going to be rich in vitamins. So vitamin C is one thing you've probably heard of, like, especially right now when you think about the immune boosting functions of it and helping our bodies is, yes, vitamin C is also technically an antioxidant, but vitamin C is only going to be found in fresh fruits and vegetables. So it's going to be found in a lot of, obviously, your citrus fruits, but also things, even kale, dark leafy greens have some. So making sure that you're getting in that variety so that you don't feel like you always have to rely on a multivitamin. There are times and places where I would suggest a multivitamin for some people if they have other conditions or are taking certain medications, or again, have to eliminate a certain food group. Other things are going to be minerals. So things like potassium, that's technically an electrolyte. That's going to be found in bananas. And a lot of other foods as well. But all of these things, you can think of fruits and vegetables as being the thing that actually we don't eat enough of because they take a little bit of work. They take a little bit of prep in our days. And if we're not planning ahead, then it's hard to actually make sure we're getting enough in. And so like I mentioned before, each color is actually going to represent a different nutrient. So a lot of our, you've probably heard before, eat the rainbow. So a lot of these different colors are going to represent different actual nutrients and vitamins. So for a lot of people, they're like, well, can I just eat the same thing every day? I'm like, theoretically you could, but you might be missing out on that variety, and those colors are going to be really important. All right, so here's a habit that you can start to incorporate is, if you don't already, trying to look at, if you'd eat almost no fruits or vegetables right now, then it's looking at, can we start to eat maybe one fruit or vegetable in your day? If you're pretty good with eating two, then it's like, or if you're good at eating one, let's up it to two. If you're good at eating two, let's up it to three. And so looking at how do we really start to incorporate that? So again, we're giving our body that fighting chance to ward off any sort of disease, to improve our digestion, and to make sure that we're getting in enough nutrients. Okay, so here's what I like to think about when we think about overall variety around food. So a lot of times, especially now around the new year, there's always the fancy stuff. And I think of all of the fancy stuff is if it's like a specific diet like Whole30 or keto or all of these other things, that's like going straight up to fancy stuff. Or even if it's specific supplements, that's straight up fancy stuff. That's a lot of quick fixes that people are looking for that may not actually be the thing they're looking for. So first and foremost, I like to think of this pyramid idea of looking at, can we start from the bottom and slowly start to build up? So first and foremost, it's looking at access to food. So do we have enough access to food in our day? So whether that is financial access to food, if you don't or are struggling with food insecurity, we can start to look at where are some resources in town that we can help improve that access so you are getting in a variety of balance in your day. But also sometimes too, if you aren't struggling with food insecurity, it's looking at, do you give yourself an opportunity? Do you pack and plan for your day? Are there days that you just walk out the door without anything and tell yourself that I'm going to figure it out? You're probably not giving yourself enough access to food in that aspect. So first and foremost, it's like, do we have enough access to food? Do we have enough food in our day? Most of the time, most of us typically do, or we could find it. And then it's looking at, second, once we have enough access, it's looking at, do we have enough frequency? So are we eating frequently enough in our day so that we're not going through, again, that wild hunger pendulum? But do we have enough frequency that where you're eating when you're hungry, you're generally stopping when you're full, and that if you are an active person, are you also eating and fueling around those activities? Once you have enough frequency and access, then we can look at that variety aspect. So this is where it starts to come into, like, are you balancing your meals? Do you have some sort of carbohydrate, some sort of fiber, some sort of protein and fat coming in? And that's when we can really start to look at, what does that balance feel like for you and what feels best for you? Then we can look at overall adequacy. So once we have that variety, then it's looking at maybe honing in a little bit more of that adequacy of, okay, cool, now let's look at maybe some of those micronutrients. Do you have that overall variety within this adequacy, and do you have enough of that? And then once we get there, typically we don't need any of the fancy stuff because we don't need the supplements anymore. We don't feel like have this need to do some of these crash diets or feel like we need to do these big resets or any of the fancy stuff, because we've actually already built up from the bottom and made sure that we have that access and that variety and that overall frequency in our day. So that's my fancy little graphic for how I like to think about nutrition and how I think about, even if it's starting from the bottom, of how do we really start to incorporate some of these behaviors in our day. Okay, so we have about 10-ish minutes left for anyone who has questions about any of this. I know I dumped a lot of information about you, or a lot of information on you, but hopefully there's some easy takeaways here that you can start to look back on. And if you're looking at, instead of starting a full-on resolution or restarting everything, it's really maybe taking one of these little habits that you can in the rest of your day. So I'll give a second. Okay, I'm reading you some of these questions. 1 second. So for one, to answer Karen's question in the box, ulcerative colitis is a gastrointestinal disorder that is very specific, and there is specific dietary recommendations that we need to look at for it. So it's looking at what types of fibers are you taking in, definitely what types of starches. And so when it comes from fructose, definitely looking at, it's not necessarily the sugar content, but more of the fiber content and what types of fibers. There's a whole variety of different fibers that we could look at. But for someone who has a sensitive digestive tract, there are specific diets that we can really start to look at for that management and calming down that inflammatory process, and then starting to reintroduce some of those foods. But oftentimes with ulcerative colitis, there's also medical management and medication management that may need attention as well. My thoughts on dehydrated fruit. So let's talk about that. So I talked a lot too about hydration and how important that is. And so to me, dehydrated fruits are great. It's a great way to get in fruit in your day. Sometimes there is a lot of added sugar added to them, especially if it's something like a cherry, because they're typically very, very tart. And so that's one thing, is look out for if they've added other sugar content to it. And if they haven't, then it should be totally fine. But know that sometimes it can cause a little little bit of stomach cramping because our body, if you remember way back to maybe biology when you were younger, of the osmotic process of high concentration to low concentration, our intestines like to have a specific amount of hydration in them. And if we are introducing something that is already dehydrated, our body is going to then start to rehydrate it. And so I think in that sense, if you're taking in a lot of dehydrated fruit, definitely focus on how much water are you drinking as well. But I think it can be a great part of an overall healthful diet as well. Are we nearing a point where you don't have to waste time with food? Can we just drink a shake or eat a tablet? Yes and no. I think that, yes, technically Soylent is something that exists. There's also a company called Huel that's more of a plant-based of all the things that you need in one thing. And I think that you totally can do that. But again, that takes away that pleasure and enjoyment and relationship to food that I find is really important. But I do think because for a lot of people, they don't have time to cook, they don't want to cook, they don't care about it. Then it's looking at how do we make food easier for you? So is that relying on some convenience foods in the sense of like, looking at canned beans instead of making your own beans, like let's use some canned beans, let's rinse them and wash them, but let's use some canned beans or frozen foods. Can we use frozen fruits and vegetables instead as an easier, more convenient, shelf-stable way that we can get in these things so you don't have to spend a ton of time propping or chopping and prepping in the kitchen. There's also a bunch of like meal prep companies or things like that that are available, but I do think there's ways that you can easily get all your needs met through some sort of shake or something, but you may be missing out on, again, that pleasure and enjoyment aspect of food, or like enjoying food in community, which I think is important as well. Okay, so a few other questions here. Oop, let me back up. How do you advise people to be smart about salt intake? So this is great. I actually did a podcast recently and talked, that was one of the first questions is salt. And I think it really depends. So let's even go back a little bit. So the main reasons why we want to decrease salt is because if you have heart failure, a cardiac disease, or any sort of kidney disease, even like high blood pressure, things like that, we definitely want to look at salt intake. I think also because salt tastes really good. What salt does from a culinary perspective, I'm also like a chef too, what it does is it actually brings out flavors and makes things very floral and beautiful. So the food industrialization, they realize that people like sugar and people like salt. So those are the two things that are added to basically everything. And so I think it's really looking first and foremost of, again, how much activity do you do? Do you sweat a lot? If you're someone who sweats a lot, we may want to look at, do you have enough salt in your diet? And do you have enough salt around that activity? But for someone who doesn't move their body or sweat a whole lot and is really looking at managing overall diseases and overall general wellness, it's looking at how do we decrease maybe some of that processed food? How do we maybe look for some of that other hidden salt that may be in some more of those packaged foods? And how do we start to learn and look at reading labels? So technically it's about a 2,000 milligram for, that's technically even like a low sodium diet is a 2,000 milligram diet. And so in that sense, it's just really looking at some of those labels. And if you see something that has 800 or 1,000 milligrams in a serving, know that that's probably too much for that individual person. Looking at calcium, so definitely being vegan and or vegetarian or having certain dietary restrictions or preferences, again, we are going to be decreasing some of those nutrients, but a lot of times you're told the only way you can get enough nutrients in or enough calcium specifically is by having dairy in your diet, and that's just inherently not true. We can get a lot of calcium from tofu, from dark leafy greens, we can get it in from beans, so there's a lot of other places you can get it in that you don't have to take a supplement in, but it's just, again, making sure, are you eating enough? Are you eating a rounded diet within your parameters of not just eating the same thing every day? And are you really looking at that plant content and are you getting enough of those colors in? Yeah, we can totally talk through the sugar challenge. I'm going to pass it over to Danica. Okay, so thinking about the sugar challenge, things I want to think about are again just looking for the overall added sugar content in things because again, sugar tastes good. Our brains love it. Same with salt. And so it's looking at how do we just be a little bit more aware of where this sugar is coming in from and how do we start to just know that it is in a lot of places and knowing that we can actually be in control of it because we do generally take in a lot of added sugars if you're taking in a lot of other processed food. So it's really just knowing when you're taking it in and being intentional about it. It's like if you want to have a cookie, great, but let's just make sure it's also not hiding in your granola that you think is super quote unquote healthy because it's also organic and all these other things. So some ways that you can start to decrease your added sugar intake is through infused water. So throw some citrus in it, throw some lemon in it, especially if you're someone who grew up with mostly like drinking juice or drinking sugar sweetened beverages. Water is really not exciting to some people. So it's looking at how do we maybe make that a little bit more exciting by adding some fruits in it or things like that. Also looking at if you're doing either a dry January or a damp January or a wet January, know that there's a lot of sugar typically coming in through alcoholic drinks as well. So getting savvy with this of like, if you are partaking in alcoholic drinks, obviously knowing that yes, alcohol does impact our liver and we need to look at can we also make sure most of our intake is not generally non-alcoholic, but in that sense, can we look at having some fun with some of the carbonated waters and again having some fun with some of those citrus blends and decreasing instead of just having like a drink with 7-Up of how do we maybe do mostly soda water and then having some lemon lime and maybe a splash of 7-Up or something that's a little bit more sweet in that sense. Looking at nutrition labels, I think is really important. So, how do we start to choose our condiments? And so, plain Greek yogurt can be an option, but also there's also some lower sugar options too, because some companies, what is it? There's some of the skier companies or the Icelandic companies that have lower sugar options that are also really great and that can fit within this budget. It's again, the purpose of the sugar challenge is not to eliminate all sugar and become hyper vigilant. It's just to bring awareness and to try to not go over that bank that you have, depending on whether you're male or female and based on your overall intake. So getting really savvy with looking at how do we incorporate some salsas? How do we incorporate other additions onto our foods that make it fun and make it interesting? So trying to look at, where are your desserts coming in? Looking at, again, if you're someone who's like, I have to have this every day, it's being aware of, okay, am I using this as an emotional coping thing? Is there something else that would get to the end of this feeling and actually resolve it? Is there a way that I can maybe start to look at some other ways that I could have maybe some dark chocolate? Maybe it's looking at, even if it's just straight up applesauce, most applesauce isn't always sweetened, but looking at, can you have maybe some sort of fruit instead? Maybe you're going to have bananas. There's actually some really great like chocolate covered banana and strawberry covered things in the frozen section. I think they have them at Sprouts. But those are super fun to just add on into things so that if you're like, I want something, but we can also start to get in some of those nutrients as well. And so it's also looking at trying to look at, can you start to be savvier in the kitchen? Because a lot of times we turn to a lot of convenience foods, which they're marketed to sell. So we may turn to some of these things out of convenience or because we don't want to cook or don't want to prep. So it's learning, how do we start to sometimes cook a little bit more for ourselves at home? Or how do we start to make the prep easier for ourselves? So is it getting pre-chopped things? Is it getting frozen things? Is it getting something to make you choosing more mindful decisions, that you can make this cooking process easier and maybe more enjoyable. And I think too, for anyone who has kids, this can be a really great way, especially if you have kids that are maybe choosy eaters, getting them involved in the cooking process and getting them exposed to foods can be really a really great way that they will actually start to experience foods better and be more likely to eat certain foods that they may not have before. So if y'all have any other questions, let me know. Again, know you can always reach out to me. You're welcome to book a session with me if any of this brought up any ideas or thoughts. Again, I'd love to work on anyone who wants to talk about relationship to food. And really, my goal for you is to go into 2022 of thinking of how do we, if I can't do this for the rest of my life, then really looking at what is the sustainability of this, especially all since we're so tired and worn out by so many things. Don't let this be another stressful thing or a way that you're letting yourself down, and really just look at what are these simple things I can start to change.
Abby, this was awesome. This was a really great session. I had so many little things that I wanted to bring in. I know you were saying that you wanted to share some of your video resources, like you had done a chopping or a knife demonstration. So if you want to share some of those videos, I can include that with the recording when we're sending those out.
Yeah, I can totally do that. Yeah, and I can send along some helpful things as well.
You don't have to know how to do any of these things. If you Pinterest, like many of us do, there are dozens, probably hundreds of boards around mocktails and infused waters and some healthier alternatives for desserts. So let the internet bring you really great information. And this is just about how to create a sustainable lifestyle shift, how to add more goodness to your life. And we're looking at doing that in multiple areas of our life. So I'm really glad that we are continuing the sugar challenge and shifting it a little bit in relationship to helping people to be more mindful what they're eating, how they're eating, and to add more goodness to their everyday life. So I
Yeah,
want
I
to
think
say
that'd be,
thanks. Thank
yeah,
you,
that's a
Abby.
great, yeah, that's, sorry, one last little thing. It's just a really great takeaway. Instead of looking at what can I reduce or restrict, think about what can I add.
Mhm. Always from abundance, always from abundance. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you again, Abby. Thank you to NAPEP for making this opportunity available for members. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.